if the Government of Ontario has downloaded things like the highways and like housing to the City of Toronto, and if the City of Toronto Act was meant to allow us to have the means to pay for some of those kinds of things, and if you are now telling us that some of those powers given under the City of Toronto Act are to be denied to us, in fact, a number of them are based on discussions I've had with her, a liquor tax, for example, they've basically made impractical for us to even think about. And so if that's going to be the case, then I want to know what the plans are for you to support social housing, for example, and what the plans are to go beyond the gas tax increment announced today, which is welcomed, because we need more than this to address $33 billion in unfunded projects that have been sitting around here for decades. I've said before, I don't intend to be the mayor that leaves City Hall with that number having reached some other much higher number. I intend to be the mayor that gets on with my council colleagues to building these things, and that involves paying for it because people know it's not free, and that involves us being prepared to step up, which we were prepared to do, and it involves the province clearly now doing more in light of the fact they've denied us the opportunity to do something we democratically said we would do.
Do you think this sets a new precedent as far as limiting the powers of the City of Toronto? Does it take this precedent?
I think it takes us in the wrong direction. When you have a Government of Ontario that has downloaded things onto the city and then has put an act in place to say, well, we're going to help you to make up for that and allow you to raise the money to pay for that, and then they turn around and say, oh, well, we didn't really mean that because some of the things that are in there we're telling you can't do, we don't want you to do, and so on, then I'd say, well, they have some answering to do on that, and the answering that would be best is if they just said, fine, we will provide those funds to you to fix the housing, which I've been asking them to do for a long, long time now.
Mayor Tory, how surprised?
Sorry, I go, okay, and then David was here, and then we'll go there. So we'll go here.
Okay. Did the Premier call you directly about this decision? Is there a part of you that feels betrayed because of all the signals given by the province that it was going to be a go? And finally, are road tolls dead in Toronto?
I said to you that I have a very open relationship with the Premier, and I do, and I will continue to. She did call me and tell me about this, and we talked about it, and it wasn't really presented as a subject for debate. It was just presented as something that they were doing, and I didn't have all the details, so I had to await this morning's announcement, as you all did, in order to know exactly what they were doing. But she did call me. And with respect to the subject of road tolls, I can only say that the City of Toronto Act remains, as it was yesterday. And it specifically acknowledges that subject to a simple regulatory approval by the Government of Ontario, the City of Toronto can bring in road tolls. And so I would assume that provision is still there unless they take it out. And that's what's so puzzling about all this is that, that was included in the City of Toronto Act, a specific contemplation. And then when you turn around and say, okay, since it's there, we're asking, and they said no. So that's the part that remains a bit of a mystery, to say the least.
Mayor Tory, can I ask, there's a long history of the city demanding money from the province for housing and other things, and the province essentially ignoring or sort of patting the city on the head. So right now, what leverage do you have? I mean, the province needs you for Presto, which is being problematic at best. So what levers are you going to use to try to force the province to make up this extra money?
I think the ultimate leverage I have is that I am the elected leader of almost 3 million people in the biggest city in Canada, the economic engine of Ontario, which has some serious challenges that can stand in the way of our being able to create the jobs and create the prosperity and, quite frankly, produce the tax revenue that fuels the Government of Ontario and the Government of Canada. And I intend to go forward, as I have been doing, and continue to be an advocate, a relentless advocate, with respect to housing, with respect to childcare, with respect to transit and transportation, because the notion of this city standing still and sort of relying on the old excuse, which is, well, we just don't have the money to deal with this, I think has been already rejected by the people. It is causing the city to show some signs of decline in terms of congestion, in terms of our attractiveness as a place to invest. We're still very attractive, but I don't want to see the city go into any kind of a decline on my watch, and I will use that leverage and the podium that I'm afforded as the leader of the council, and with the backing, I hope, of my council colleagues to continue to make the case. It is a case that has absolutely irrefutable returns if the province chooses to make these investments, and the other argument that can't really be contradicted is if they're not going to let us do it, if they're not going to let us do it by the means that are provided for in the legislation, then I believe they have an absolute obligation to step up and make sure they provide us, as they've done in part today, but only in part, with predictable, stable funding to address city priorities.
Mayor Tory, what does this mean for more urgent infrastructure projects, such as the ballooning cost of the Gardner repair? Does this mean the hybrid option
Is it still possible? Do we need to go back to the drawing board?
I think you will know that there were included in the city's capital budgets going forward substantial sums to address things like the Gardiner Expressway, and those sums are still in the budget. What the road tolls would have done in part, because they were restricted to transportation and transit, is to have a degree of flexibility with respect to that capital budgeting to perhaps reallocate some of that money to housing, for example, or to childcare or to some other transit project. And so I think until these matters are resolved, and I think we shouldn't conclude today as an end point, today is a beginning point of a discussion I intend to pursue vigorously with the Premier starting next week to say, fine, if you have told us we cannot use the tools that your government or your predecessor government gave to us to address some of the things you downloaded onto us and the previous government did, then please tell us how we're going to finance these things. Because the option, I believe, for the Government of Ontario and for the Government of Toronto of standing still and letting the status quo prevail for another 10 years, after 20 years of inaction on housing and on transit, it's not an option I'm ever prepared to accept as long as I'm here, and it's not an option that is in the best interest of the people of Toronto.
The hybrid plan, even though it ballooned by $1 billion?
Well, again, I'm not going to accept your characterization of what happened with the cost. In fact, a big part of the cost that grew was on the west side that has nothing to do with the hybrid. And again, I think we have to be careful with regard to how we use these numbers. But I will only say that that is a project for which there is a substantial allocation included right now in the city's capital plan going forward, and that money is still there, and no one's taken it away. The tolling money would have provided us with a degree of greater flexibility on that and other projects to do more. And we've been given some more gas tax money, and that is a step in the right direction, but only a step. And I'm not going to sort of, say any project is affected, because the fact is, as of this moment in time, no project is affected by this decision today. It just really calls into question our ability to proceed with a much more ambitious, honest agenda of getting things done.
Back when this was first announced, Kathleen Wynne had come out and said the City of Toronto is a mature level of government. Obviously giving the signal that she would allow this to happen. So I guess first, how surprised are you that she on the one hand called us a mature level of government and then made this step today? And second, where does this leave us on things like municipal sales tax and portions of the HSC?
I described to you, I think, earlier on, as I did to the public and to my council colleagues, how I arrived at the place where I came forward and recommended to my council colleagues, and they endorsed the road tolls as the most acceptable of a series of options. And I've said many times before, with a smile on my face, I know nobody was going to throw a ticker tape parade for me down Bay Street for having chosen road tolls as opposed to some other form of charge or taxation. But at the end of the day, I also knew that people expected me of all people, because I was new to this and because I said I was going to try to be more honest and straightforward and make sure that we said these things had to get done and that they weren't free. And so, taking that honest approach, having rejected other options, I was comfortable with that, and we got an overwhelming mandate from the members of City Council. And so, in that respect, I would have thought that that was all that the Government of Ontario needed to say, well, we gave you this, latitude to use this, among other things. You did what we've always said we want cities to do, all cities, which is to ask for something you want. We asked for it through an overwhelming vote of the City Council. And they said no. So I don't know where it leaves us, quite frankly, and that's part of what I have to discuss with the Premier next week. But I can tell you one place it's not going to leave us, as far as I'm concerned. I will be relentless, as I said, in making sure there is some means provided for us to raise the billions of dollars we need to build transit and fix traffic and fix the housing, and it cannot be through property taxes alone. They were never meant to sustain double-digit increases to finance multi-billion-dollar capital projects, which, quite frankly, the other levels of government should be participating in. Now, the other part of your question was?
Well, you kind of answered about the municipal taxes and stuff.
Oh, the sales tax. Look, before we fastened upon the recommendation I made to Council, which they subsequently accepted to move forward with road tolls, I canvassed with the Premier and others in the Ontario government the whole host of other options. And I mentioned to you the liquor tax earlier on, and I sort of thought, well, one of the things people are often prepared to accept is if they have, say, $1 put on the price of every bottle of wine and alcohol at the LCBO, and they're prepared to sort of accept that as what they used to call a sin tax. And I asked for that, and the Premier said no. She said, no, we're not going to get into two pricing regimes, and we don't want you getting involved in collecting money from the LCBO. That is a power that we were given in the City of Toronto Act. So again, that one gets stroked off the list. And now road tolls are stroked off the list. And so you get to the point where the City of Toronto Act, which was meant to account for the downloading that was foisted upon us years ago, is now the means of addressing that on our own are taken away from us. And the sales tax was never on the table. We've got a request in based on a city council resolution, but I can assure you, when I've raised the notion of, shares of income tax and sales tax and HST and things like that, I have had no take-up. Like, how about none? And that's fine. I mean, I accept that, but you can't sort of say no to everything and then expect us to actually get things done in one of the fastest growing cities in North America, a city that is the engine of this province. And it is frustrating for me, as the mayor duly elected of the biggest city in Canada and the biggest city in Ontario and the economic engine of this province that keeps this province driving forward, not alone, but it is the key success factor. It is very frustrating to have our needs, which are legitimate and catalogued and measured, in areas like housing and transportation, where there are extraordinary needs that go way beyond. I heard the minister refer this morning, in the same breath as talking about Toronto, to the bus service in Wawa and Sioux Lookout. Wawa has one bus, and you call it to come to your house to pick you up. And the notion that we would be compared, and I say this with no disrespect to these communities whatsoever, I've been in them all, but the notion you would compare the needs of a city of millions of people, that has millions of people going to work on transit and going to school every day, and the notion that we'd be put in with them, that's part of the problem here. When people decide to stand up and admit something that is just a fact, which is that the City of Toronto is Canada's champion, we are the only global metropolis in this country. And I say that again with no disrespect to my colleagues in Montreal or Vancouver or anywhere else. We are a global metropolis. We have needs that go way beyond and are more complex than cities much smaller than us and towns that are much smaller than us in this province. And it is time that we stop being treated, and I stop being treated as a little boy going up to Queen's Park in short pants to say, please, could you help me out with something that I thought was in the City of Toronto Act that I could do, and to be told, no, I'm terribly sorry, go away and come back some other day, when houses are falling down and having to be closed up, transit needs are not being met, traffic is in chaos, and that is just something that is a reality that has faced my predecessors, and it faces me now, but I'm not giving up.
The reality is that nobody in this country has ever lost votes by dumping on Toronto. You have to fight through that, and you said you were to, but what's going to change? What will you do differently than in the past? Because this is obviously a decision for the 905 voters over the 416 voters. How do you break through that?
Well, I try not to look at things in that way. I mean, I guess that, I would prefer to look at it on the basis that we have 3 million people, almost, living in the city that is the economic powerhouse of Ontario. The success of Toronto is going to be as directly tied to the success of Ontario as any other place or any other group of people or any other business or enterprise or college or hospital. And this city must succeed for Ontario to succeed. And this city has been underinvested in for decades now, and I'm setting about, including being prepared to take some responsibility and accountability for that with my colleagues, and we've been told no. And so now we have to regroup and go back and say, all right, let's not turn this into a 905-416 thing. Let's talk about what is in the best interest of the City of Toronto. I happen to believe, and I know there'd be people in 905, and I'm sure in other parts of the country, who will completely reject my description of Toronto as Canada's global metropolis. That's fine. But I do know this. If we are successful, every part of this country, including 905, benefits immensely from it. And I've proven myself, without any contradiction, to be a person who will put the interests of Toronto together with the interests of the region. I was the person who conceived of and saw through to fruition Toronto Global, where we go together to seek foreign investment. And that's me putting on a hat of saying I am going to go as the mayor of the biggest city with my colleagues to attract investment, because I believe a rising tide lifts all boats. But it goes the other way too. As Toronto does well, so do the regions outside of Toronto, including all the way out to the west and the east coast. It's why I spoke up when it came to the fentanyl crisis. Yes, we have our own problem here, but I saw they had a crisis of unbelievable, unspeakable proportions in the city of Vancouver, and I spoke up to help the mayor and the city and the people of Vancouver, because that's my job as not just the mayor of Toronto, but as a national leader of the biggest city in the country. So I'll just fight on, Oliver, and I'm not for giving up, and so we'll just fight on.
En français, Monsieur Max, vous essayez d'être bon joueur depuis le début de la conférence de presse, d'être calme, mais vous semblez aussi très frustré, parce que ce qu'on comprend, c'est que c'est la ville de Toronto qui est perdante au final. Est-ce que c'est juste?
Oui, je suis frustré, mais parce que la ville de Toronto est la plus grande ville de tout le Canada. Et nous avons besoin de beaucoup d'argent pour investir dans la transportation en commun, dans le logement, etc. Et le gouvernement de la province de l'Ontario dit non. Et c'est un problème pour moi.
Alors, est-ce que c'était un argument logique de la part de la première ministre ou c'est carrément une décision politique?
C'est les deux. Mais maintenant, la seule situation que je sais est vraie est que nous avons besoin de beaucoup des projets maintenant que n'a pas l'argent adéquat de bâtir. Et c'est un problème pour les citoyens de Toronto.